So, Horus Travers has released. We had a lot of cool patch changes. There were actually a couple of cards that changed that are new, specifically some draft cards. We can actually talk about those first. Let's see if I remember them all. So we had a Skycrag Drake that changed to a 5/3 from a 4/3, which is... I don't remember exactly what it's called. It was a 7-drop. Oh, and I'm still on Horus Travers, that's why it's not showing up. Yeah, Topaz Drake changed from a 4/3 to a 5/3, so we got that extra point of damage. That makes it a much more viable draft card because it is just a card that you can play to actually start pushing a clock. 5 damage is just a lot more valuable than 4 on a flyer, and it's a really, really important jump in power to make this card quite viable in Skycrag, I would say. This is decent damage, it's going to be a pretty decent card. The other one that I was really excited about was the Praxis 7-drop, which is Sandglass Sentinel. This one changed up to a 4/6 from a +4, like a 4/6. It changed up from a 3/6 to a 4/6, and it got the +3 to a +4 on its overwhelm, which means that Sandglass Sentinel is now a more powerful pusher than the 7-drop that shares a stat line with it, or shares a bunch of abilities with it, which is to say that, like, there's a 7/7 that has Empower to get Overwhelm. This card has Play a Spell to get Overwhelm, and then also would go up to about 6, which wasn't great. So now it is an 8/6 Overwhelm with just 1 spell. You're going to be playing spells pretty frequently with Sandglass Sentinel, so this card is actually another good way to push across damage in Praxis. And I think that that's pretty cool to have that little bit of extra. I'm trying to remember the other 2 cards that have changed. I will probably have to look at the patch notes. Valkyrie Militant was one of them. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so Valkyrie Militant was not a card that I really believed in at all previously. I did think that card was quite underpowered in draft, and it has been updated to now give you +2 when you play a weapon instead of +1. That is a very significant buff. Valkyrie Militant is still not a card that pressures on its own, but it now has some synergy with relic weapon strategies, which means that you can play this card with Talon of Nostrix with your 5-cost, I believe it's called Mace, Silverwing Mace, something like that. And like basically any sort of good relic weapons will really, really help out with this particular setup. The weapon bonus means that you can actually stick some good stuff on Valkyrie Militant and get a decent amount of action out of it. I wouldn't say that you want to rely heavily on that strategy, but if you're trying to play the Valkyrie Spire Guard, Militant is actually a playable card now, which makes the whole Valkyrie draft archetype a lot better because it is one of the key commons in the Valkyrie draft. Mithril Mace. Yes, that's correct. That's correct. And then finally we have Cabal Bludgeoner, a card that really was not seeing a lot of action and probably still will not see a lot of action in the ranked setup. Like, all 4 of these cards still are only really good in draft, but this one now goes from a 2/3 to a 3/3, which means it is quite a bit nastier when it's wielding a weapon and can be used to Voltron up something kind of scary. This is still not a great card because it's very vanilla even when it wields a weapon, but and it compares very poorly to the 3/2 that gets a +1/+1 when wielding a weapon. However, it is a Minotaur, so it has some cool Minotaur synergy. It has good weapon synergy, which means that if you have good weapons, you can pick it up, and it's a common, so it fills out a slot pretty well. I would say that all of these, like, improvements to the setup just improve the archetype in general and mean that you can pick them better as fill cards and really, really get a lot of benefit out of them. So if you need to fill a 7 slot to make sure that you have some way to push damage across, there's good options in Praxis and Skycrag now. And if you need to fill a 4 slot to make sure that you can just, like, do some cool weapon stuff, there's good options in Argenport. So that's really, really solid. All right. We're doing the spoiler breakdown, Avocado. So yeah, or not the spoiler breakdown, but rather the patch breakdown. Just talking about Horus Travers cards and all of the cards that we've seen. Okay. So that gets us to the Horus Travers cards. Everything that released with the campaign, the 25,000 coin, really, really good campaign. Like, this one was a lot of fun. It had a very good storyline. I thought that it did a very good job of sort of explaining, like, what the strangers are, what their intentions are, and how things are sort of going with it. I won't spoil any of it for you here, but, like, it was pretty nuts, and I think it did go pretty well. So in addition, it was a lot of fun to play, and the cards that you got out of it were pretty strong. There's some decently good picks here that you're really going to want to play around with. Some of them are more build decks around me, and some of them are more like actual powerhouses. So we can talk about all of those and what the particular stars are. Okay, so we've got Cinder Yeti, the 3/2 Overwhelm Warp that says Summon, Exhaust an Enemy Unit. This card fits more in Yeti Tribal Skycrag than anything else. I don't think it has too many other places. It does mean that there is an extra warp card in heavy warp decks, which can be very useful, and that fills a slot as well. It is understated. The Overwhelm and the Exhaust ability are both quite strong, but together the package is not incredibly impressive. I think this card is slightly above average, but not amazing, and certainly as only a ranked card, it's a bit underwhelming. But if you're playing a lot of Yetis, there's some reason to play it, especially since warp essentially means a decent amount of card draw in Yeti decks where you already have a lot of cheap stuff. So you're pretty likely to be able to play Cinder Yeti to draw a card at some point. Usually a free 3-drop, that's really not something that you can discount, but I would say that it's not the strongest card in Horus Travers by any means, but still, it's kind of interesting. Kindle. I love this card. 3 cost, +4 power this turn, +5 power this turn instead if you spark. I've had a lot of fun with this card. I've lost a lot of games with this card. It is a card that definitely has a lot of insane potential to do very, very silly things. Play good 4-drops on turn 3, play good 5-drops on turn 3 with a good aggressive deck, which can be really nice. You can use it to get out the next card on our list very, very quickly, which is always nice, but typically just means that you'll 2-for-1 yourself on whatever it is that you're trying to play as a 4-drop. If you're using it to get relics out early, then that's a little bit more interesting, and it certainly can be used to also hit 8-drops a little faster. So if you're playing, like, say, Skycrag, trying to get Channel the Tempest out, and you already are playing, like, a lot of blue, that's something that's really interesting. I think this card really does best when it's getting something very cheaty out ahead of tempo, and if that is a good enough benefit for you, Kindle is a very good card. Obviously, that's very specific, and it's very hard to do, so it makes your decks less reliable. You have to really build around it. This is a combo card through and through, but I love it, and it's a great addition to Eternal. So, love this card. Crimson Firemaw, 5/4 flying. When it hits the enemy player, reduce the cost of the top card of your deck by 4. I need to take another pass at this one, because when I reviewed it last time, I believe I reviewed this as a summon effect. You know, like, I think I was vague enough about it that it was still, like, sort of a thing that I thought was important. But, yeah, without it being a summon effect, it is a little bit weaker, I would say, even though the effect is repeatable, and also the effect is better than I expected, because not only does it reduce the cost of the top card of your deck by 4, but it does it in Warcry style, meaning that if the card on top of your deck is a power, then the next card down gets reduced by 4. If the card on top of your deck is already free, then the next card down gets reduced by 4. You can repeat this effect as many times as you like, so you can make your entire deck free with enough Crimson Firemaw hits, although at that point your opponent should probably be dead. This card's a super efficient stat line on a monocolored unit. It is a little bit vulnerable, but it's a very good 4-drop for fire. There's obviously no contending that it is something that you're going to be wanting to play on curve. I would say the cost reduction effect is not super important to Firemaw's general game plan, but I have seen some pretty interesting uses of it so far, and if you can use it to actually make something cheaper, sometimes it really benefits you. Big Praxis, anything with, like, very expensive spells, Crimson Firemaw does pretty good work there, and I would say that it's a pretty reasonable expectation that hitting the enemy player is going to do a lot of bad things for them. However, Crimson Firemaw is more likely a card that is going to get killed before hitting the enemy player. It is a threat that must be dealt with nonetheless, and if you are actually succeeding in hitting with it, then you're getting a very, very good amount of damage with it. I would say this card is just really, really reliable offensive fire card. Very good in the slot. Fire did not have good 4-drops before, so really, really solid for that. It's got clear weaknesses in terms of defense. It's not the powerhouse that I thought it was, but it is just, like, you definitely want to play it at 4. So, yeah, A card. Really, really good. Power Stone, probably my absolute favorite of the, no, definitely my absolute favorite of the Horus Travers cards. This card is just really, really good at ramping you up to 4. It is permanent ramp, which is something that Secret Pages has always wanted to be, but was never good enough to do. And yeah, this has worked very well in all of the decks that I've tried it in, although most of the decks that you try it in are decks that really want to get to 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s, and 8s, which means that mid-range stuff really likes Power Stone. This card is awesome at doing that particular job. It isn't a card that fits in every deck, but it fits very well into slow mid-range that doesn't require a lot of influence, and that's something that you can definitely fiddle around with. I think there's not only a lot of, like, interesting extra power for those decks, but there's also some cool power for decks that want to run very heavy influence in this particular set. So yeah, it adds a lot of variety to Eternal, and I think that Power Stone is a very, very healthy card that should be a lot of fun to play with in the future. New Tomorrow has benefited tremendously from the addition of this card, and it's one of my favorite cards in that deck as well as just in this set. Dilfex Stalker. We've talked about this one a little bit. I have found him to be a very good utilitarian card at 3. Like, does pretty much everything that it says on the tin, trades evenly with any one unit, kills Hero of the People, kills some things that you would really rather die that have Aegis. It's a very, very effective card for just making sure that your deck has a decent amount of interactivity and versatility. It is a card that you will feel is underwhelming and will be tempted not to put into your deck, and sometimes that will be a mistake because Dilfex Stalker actually really does fill that utility slot in a way that you kind of need to do at 3. I think he belongs in some Xenon Life Force decks and some other decks that really want to just have units that get bigger. Evelina is a very strong play with it, and like dinosaur decks in general are the best place for Dilfex Stalker, but it might actually have a decent amount of places that it can fit in other decks as well. Regardless, it's not a terribly strong card. It is a card that trades pretty evenly. And cards like that have traditionally been buffed previously, like Banish, for example. This card's not going down to 2, so it will always remain somewhat average at its utility slot, but I think it fills enough of a hole that it's actually a pretty good card. Devoted Theurge, 4/4/4/4. Summon, you gain 4 health, pay 6 to give it +1/+1, and you gain 1 health. I like this card better in New Tomorrow than I like it in Life Force, but I do think it has a very strong place in certain Life Force decks. It really depends on where you're going with your Life Force deck, whether you want to be evasive, whether you want to be big, or whether you want to be small. If you want to be big, Devoted Theurge really does that part well. So basically, if you're trying to get up to the 4s to 6s, if you're trying to get up into like the really expensive like stuff like Beckoning Lumen, Devoted Theurge is doing that really well because he's a pretty good card to develop the board while also gaining life, and then also giving you additional Life Force triggers later in the game. Katra decks often try to rush you down with a lot of very, very small units early on, but if you're trying to do something more interesting with Life Force in terms of card advantage and Beckoning Lumen, or say Mask of Torment, then Devoted Theurge is definitely your card in that situation. This card also just fits pretty well in some big Combrei decks that really need to survive. It's a stand-in for Combrei Healer if you need to fill the 3-drop slot, and I think that's actually really relevant and pretty meaningful in other decks as well. So Devoted Theurge is just another good utility card that fits pretty well in quite a few decks, and I like it a lot. I would never discount that 4 health even in non-Life Force decks. Copperhall Paladin. I've loved this card. Yeah, no, this one is pretty standout for me as a 3/4 with lifesteal. It has just the right amount of stats to really counter Stonescar and Rakano decks. I know that people did not like this card when it was first revealed, but I think that it's actually quite strong, and it plays very well in a lot of decks that want to play weapons and also want to be kind of slow. Our first like sort of interesting like ladder climb deck that I really liked was a Combrei deck that runs Copperhall Paladin with not Mantle of Justice, Gilded Glaive, and playing Hammer of Mights and what's the other one? Peacekeeper's Prod on this card. Mono Green's a real faction because of Copperhall Paladin. This card definitely fills that slot. It is a very specific card with a very specific purpose, but it does that purpose very well. The Justice Sigil is definitely a good added bonus, and the lifesteal plus like just general weapon synergy means that Copperhall Paladin does a good job for me. I would say that it's done a really, really solid thing in terms of being a good lifesteal unit that is immune to both Vanquish and Torch, and that's just kind of a rough deal for a lot of people that want to do like other good things. So belongs in some good Combrei aggro decks, belongs in some Argenport Life Force or Argenport just general angry decks, and there's a lot to be looking at there. Twin Strikemaster. I haven't played with this card yet. This is probably one of the only ones that I haven't really tested. I think it is fairly pushed for a Mentor card. It is a very strong 4/4 that has a very good stat line. It gives something else double damage, and there are a lot of things that you can give double damage that are a lot scarier when you Mentor. Mentor is still an ability that has a lot of sort of kinks to work out. You have to be very careful about when you Mentor and when you do not, but Twin Strikemaster by itself is a good threat, and that's something that you really, really want to pay attention to. So yeah, I think with most Mentor cards, we generally try to evaluate the card before it has the Mentor effect in terms of what it's going to do to the board state, and Twin Strikemaster's doing an okay job as an 8/4 that responds very well to weapons. So yeah, this card belongs in a couple of different decks, and I would say that it's probably reasonable. One of the better Mentor cards out there, and yeah, beyond that, I would say, like, you know, this is a real specific sort of thing that you're trying to do with this card, so you do have to build the deck around it. Watchmen Conscript. 6 cost 5/3 with Revenge. Summon if Watchmen Conscript has Destiny. Play +2/+4 Valkyrie ring wings with flying and Aegis on him. He is now a Valkyrie. Okay. So this is probably the biggest disappointment out of Horus Travers for me, as this was a card that was printed as a 6 cost 5/3, and there was the general expectation that it must have had something very, very good on that stat line to make sure that it was going to be, you know, quite excellent. As it is, Watchmen Conscript is pretty likely to get silenced at 6, and it's also, like, as a 6 cost revenge card, not as big an impact as, say, Mokdo. It does do okay. It definitely generates a 7/7 Aegis Valkyrie at some point, so it's not unreasonable in Valkyrie decks, but since it's not a Valkyrie to start with, it doesn't buff specific Valkyrie strategies, and there are a lot of 7 cost 7/7 Valkyries out there already that you can give revenge with other cards, and it might actually be a little bit faster in terms of generating board position. I don't see where this card fits in general, and I'm pretty sure it's the worst card in Horus Travers, but it's interesting enough. The stat line's just a little too weak. The Valkyrie Wings is really nice, and it does get that revenge. It is a very meaningful card, but that's a lot of steps to take to get that revenge. Okay, Southwind Herald. 3/2 flying. At the end of your turn, if you have all 4 Wind Heralds, sacrifice them to play a 9/9 Avatar of the Winds, because my grandpa's deck has no terrible cards. I would say that basically Southwind Herald is a not unreasonable stat line for a 3/2, but playing Eastwind Herald and Southwind Herald together means that you're not doing a lot with those particular setups. I think Southwind Herald most likely belongs in a deck that is running a lot of Westwind and Northwind Heralds, and only 1 or 2 of Eastwind Herald and Southwind Herald together, and at that point you just get Avatar of Winds on a turn when your opponent isn't paying attention for 5, but you're trying basically not to play the Southwind Herald deck. If you've just played the Southwind Herald deck with 16 Heralds in it, it's not amazing, and it's interesting and fun to experiment with, but I'm not sure if it's actually a good deck. It's still a very fun deck. There are a lot of things you can do with it. I would say that Mirror Image, people have been pressuring me about using Mirror Image in this deck. It's not actually the thing that you want to do. While it does infa-kill with Avatar of Winds, it doesn't make the deck better, and once you've got Avatar of Winds, you probably have already won. But Mirror Image does have a good thing going with Westwind Herald. Westwind Herald is also a win more card in many situations, but like, I think that, you know, if you can get all of that stuff together and keep the deck fairly light, Southwind Herald has a chance of being good. But overall, it's mostly just like a really fun card to assemble, a really fun deck to build. I had a lot of fun just playing with this deck, but we also like demoted ourselves to silver. So yeah, it's neat, and I like it a lot. It is not, I would say, a good card, but I'm very glad to have the 4th Herald, and it turned out to be a really epic Herald. Avatar of Winds with its deal 5 damage to each flying enemy unit. I didn't actually explain what that card does. Deal 5 damage to each flying enemy unit and enemy player. It hits the enemy player. You play a spell from your void, and that counts the 5 damage from when it is summoned. We've summoned this once. It's well worth it, of course. Basically, if you hit that summon even once, it's just great, and it's not an ultimate effect, so you can repeat it over and over again. It's not even an infiltrate, so yeah. Good stuff. Okay. Yeti Pope. Another star card for me, actually. 4 costs for 3. 4/1, summon, deal 1 damage to 3 enemies, pay 7 and exhaust Yeti Polt to draw 3 cards, and stun Yeti Polt. That is a lot of text on a really weird body, and when I first looked at this card, I could not see how this card could actually be for me. It seemed like it was just a few too many different pieces all at once, and that it was way too vulnerable, but as it turns out, Yeti Polt tends to stick around when it's played, and it also tends to have a lot of instantaneous value when it's played. So both of those things work really well. Like, I would say that in mono blue, it actually adds a lot to the color because it gives you some good anti-aggro while also giving you the ability to just get a really interesting power sink that is very, very useful for you. In Cambrai New Tomorrow, that is like my favorite place for it. It is just a huge draw engine that also has some good anti-aggro tech. I found this card to behave extremely well, and it's just got enough instantaneous board presence and also late game value to always be an interesting top deck and usually a good card to have in hand early. So if it fits pretty much everywhere, then I'm pretty happy with it. It's goofy and interesting, and it's got a lot of things going on, and overall, like, that repeatable draw effect just seems to be fairly strong. So I'm pretty down with this card. Yeah, it turned out to be a solid BB+. Huru Teachings. For each of the students' battle skills, play a 3/3 Unseen Disciple with that battle skill. This card is terrible. Like, I don't know what to tell you. This card's really bad. It's a 7-cost card that generates, like, a reasonable amount of small units, but it cares about, like, students' battle skills, which is a thing that we've already learned from, what is the other card? The 4-cost... I believe it's called, like, Mentor's Aid or something like that. Oh, gosh, I'm going to have to look this up now. Costs 4 is not in Hit Tale of Horus Travers. Someone in chat will certainly tell me in just a second, but I can probably find it myself. It is called Master's Lesson. And, yeah, we've already learned from this card that caring about a student's battle skills is kind of really not a good thing right now. And also, like, the most that you get out of this is a full board of 3/3s, which is something that you can usually do at 7 from a lot of other positions, like Coastal Brigade's doing this kind of thing a little bit faster, Parliament's doing this kind of thing a little bit better. Like, I don't really know what you do with a bunch of 3/3s, and I don't really know why you care about your students' battle skills so much. Like, there's just never been a card that really cares about Master's Lesson. This card is primarily intended, I think, for Hero of the People decks, because people really like Hero of the People, and they play it a lot at lower levels, I think. So, like, this is something that's really fun for, like, Bronze League players to futz around with. And that's fine. Cards don't have to be built for me. I'm totally okay with that. It is a card that does, like, a really fun thing if you're playing, like, at the lower tiers. So it's cool that that card exists. But it's definitely not a card that you want to be concerning yourself with in Horus Travers. Okay. So, next up, what do we got? We're down to the last of them, I think. Oh, no. Hang on a sec. That's because we're just in Huru. There we go. We've got quite a few left. Auric Interrogator, a 4/3. At the end of your turn, if it has 5 strength or more, he deals 1 damage to you and draws a card. This is fairly powerful because we have good Minotaur decks, and you actually want to play good Minotaurs. So yeah, that's really reasonable in that situation. He's also just a good aggressive card. Like, he plays down on the board and he has real meaningful presence. You don't need to activate his ability to make him just kind of threatening, and, like, he fills that 3-drop slot pretty well. I would say that, like, he's definitely something that belongs in Minotaur decks, but there's a lot of decks that really like him, so certainly worth playing. Sadistic Valkyrie is a little trickier. I think this card is good, but I think it's very specific. It belongs in a Life Force deck, and it belongs in a really specific Life Force deck, which I haven't found yet. If you get the right Life Force deck, this card is very strong. Like, just the ability to have a 3/1 lifesteal at an early time is quite nice for you. It means that you get to trigger your life forces more often. The stat line is really quite reasonable for a 3-drop that's flying, like, or a 3-drop lifesteal that's flying. Like, I think that overall this card does a lot and is something that actually has to be removed in Life Force that isn't Katra, which is always nice. So, like, yeah, it's fairly good, but it's so specific to a particular type of deck that cares about Sadistic Valkyrie that you might never end up playing it in your own Life Force deck. So, interesting. Certainly not going to fit in that many decks, but can be particularly good in some. Alright, Dueling Pistols. Quick draw, summon given enemy unit, -2, -2. I'm not highly up on this card. It is immediate value and a good quick draw effect, but, like, it's so little value on the board, and it's not a draft card, so killing a 2/2 is usually not the thing that you want to be doing. Typically, you're more in trouble against things like Tavrod or Sandstorm Titan or False Prince or Valkyrie Enforcer even. Like, there's just so many cards with 3 health that really just don't care about this card that it really is kind of meaningless as a summon effect. And +2/+0 in quick draw, while a fairly strong effect on offense, is pretty high at 4. This card would probably be pretty good at 3, but it's not great now. Hey, thank you for the host, Totes Olive. Waker of Ancients. Your units with 5 strength or more have warp. I haven't really played with this card. I think it's a lot of fun, and it's definitely worth playing in the right type of deck. The right type of deck is just a really specific praxis deck, so it's all good. Yeah, you get that 5 strength or more. You get to basically just warp a ton of cards in your deck. You can use Waker of Ancients to get either a little amount of card advantage or to draw removal cards for some of your other threats. Although, certainly in big praxis, you don't have that many things that eat torches, so it's kind of a little tricky in that respect. And that's one of the things about the 1-2 stat line, is that, like, basically, it almost seems like it can be ignored. It's kind of nice that it's a 1-2 that can't be ignored, but, like, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if this card does a lot. I do think that it is so much fun in big praxis that it's just kind of fun to play. And, like, certainly there will be at least 1 or 2 decks that can use this to just generate, like, a complete warp out strategy, which is a lot of fun to do. Vision of Austerity. Green-blue, transform an enemy relic into an Omen of Austerity cursed relic. So I've reviewed this one before, but we finally found out what Omen of Austerity do. So Austerity does. It says the cursed player can't play cards with the name of the transformed relic. Oh, and they actually updated the text, which is good, because previously it just said can't play cards with something name. At first I thought this was a pithing needle, and I thought that was actually really cool. Like, that seemed like a really powerful effect. Omen of Austerity doesn't do it for me. It's nice that Huru has some sort of attachment destruction, for sure. I don't know that just banning your opponent's relic is all that productive. It's kind of nice to just have a single one-of answer to Chalice, to Xenon Obelisk, and for that reason you're definitely going to play this in sideboards, but this is never more than a one-of in any deck, I would say. So, like, it's reasonable. You definitely want to have it as something to Celestial Omen for. You'll probably put it in quite a few decks if you're feeling the Chalice decks are just getting too threatening, and it will significantly negate the amount of Chalice in the meta, which is good for it. But overall, this card doesn't excite me too much. It's just a card that does a thing that you really need to do, so might as well slot one in because you need it in Huru. Tavrod Auric Broker, 5/7 Endurance. Yeah, I mean, you guys probably know this card's just nuts. It is a 5/7 that can win the game if it can attack, and it is very likely to be able to attack because it is just the right amount of stats to be very, very hard to kill and to do a lot of stuff that is very, very good. We spoiled this card extensively previously. This was my spoiler for the whole setup, and I'm pleased to find that it has performed pretty much exactly as I expected. Provides a ton of advantage, makes Minotaurs really good, makes Armory decks a lot happier, is just a good card on its own because it's a 5/7 Endurance, and that means that it can both give you good offensive and defensive presence, which is very, very important in terms of just overall, like, making sure that you're stable on board. Behaves very well with a lot of different things and is resistant to almost all forms of removal. You, like, I don't know, this card's quite nuts. If you could, like, cruciate it, then that would be kind of nice, but that's about the only thing that I can think of that, like, yeah, it does everything right, and it's super strong and it's super pushed, and Argenport has a really good card now, so well worth playing and fits very well in a slot that didn't really have much in it before, with the exception of Mokto, who is also quite strong. Unexpected Results. Transform all copies of a spell of your choice from the enemy's player's deck into firebombs. My goodness, I love this card. I was already fond of using Rain of Frogs, and I generally found that Rain of Frogs most often wants to target spells, specifically Wisdom of the Elders. If you can Unexpected Results and just pick out 4 cards from your opponent's deck and turn them into firebombs, you are getting the effect of essentially having a Light the Fuse in your opponent's deck. Not quite. It's a little bit worse than a Light the Fuse, but typically this means deal 5 damage to your opponent and they can't play a spell. That's not a bad effect in terms of, like, a good Skycrag card, and if you're playing, like, a bunch of firebombs, then this card's really, really fun. I think that Skycrag wants to play this over Rain of Frogs most of the time, but it is a card that has no board presence and can come back to bite you if you are not doing something about the fact that you have no board presence with this card. Skycrag in general has an issue dealing with boards, so you need to figure out some way to actually make that happen, and then you can Unexpected Results to your heart's content. And it will do a lot of good things for you, and it will win the long game against control in a very big way. So, neat card, really, really fun. Really love this card, but I wouldn't say it's incredibly strong. Nonetheless, I would definitely play it in quite a few different decks. Cruciation. Kill a unit with a single faction and gain its health. I found this to be pretty useful. It's a good life force trigger. The health gain is pretty relevant. There are quite a few like monocolored cards that you'll want to kill, Sandstorm Titan amongst them, but mostly just like huge Warcried Rakano units. And if you do that instead of Death Strike, then you're doing better against Rakano than you were when you were playing Death Strike. I hear that there are some like I know that somebody's up at the top of the ladder playing Cruciation right now, and I do think that that is a card that can actually be played and get a really significant amount of benefit. I found it pretty beneficial in the Life Force deck. I have no idea how to play Life Force decks, but I did think that it was a good card there, and we played around with it a bit and found it to be perfectly good. Yeah, the high influence cost is pretty tricky. There are some new ways to fix for this, like Horus Travers is a really interesting card to set up for that kind of thing. We'll talk about that a little bit, but the main thing that you have to watch out for on Cruciation is that it is a hard card to cast. Nonetheless, since it's a card you primarily cast on your opponent's biggest thing near the end of the game when you want to like basically just be immune to burn, it's doing that job very well, and it's always a good top deck, which is always nice to know. Triumphant Stranger. One of every color, +1/+1 for each stranger. At the start of your turn, create and play a random stranger. This card's completely destroyed me the last couple of times that I've run up against it. Mostly just because it seems to hit Prophetic Strangers every time that they need them, and Meditative Strangers every time it needs them. But, like, I'm guessing it has some worse draws. Card's pretty random, but overall very strong. It is reliably giving you enough Strangers to really make Strangers work. And it's really nice to finally have a Stranger Queen. I would say that Triumphant Stranger definitely does the job right, and overall is pushing Strangers in a direction that is pretty good. So 5-color Strangers is something that'll want this card, and other colors of Strangers will probably want to find some way to play it, because he does just make Strangers super viable. I would say that overall he's not doing an amazing amount of work all by himself, but if you got the right Stranger deck, he goes in it, and he does that particularly well. There's nothing else that you can play him in, so you can't really evaluate the card in terms of whether or not it's like good in that particular respect, but he's probably the strongest card in a Stranger deck, so that's good. Stranger's Mark. A unit of your choice is now a Stranger. I think this card has a lot of potential to be broken. I don't know what breaks it yet, but I'm real curious. Beyond that, a 0-cost spell has some interesting connotations and could be very useful later in the game. Mostly I just really like the idea of using this to give things Aegis for 0, or to give things Endurance for 0 against like a Permafrost, to give them Quick Draw in the middle of combat, which you can't do because it's not a fast spell. But like there's a lot of interesting options that might be pretty relevant. You can't do things like give a unit on top of your deck Warp, so that's a little rough. But the more Strangers that you have down, the more you can benefit from Stranger's Mark, and that might actually be pretty good on an aggressive front, which Strangers are generally a very aggressive deck. So Strangers are very often best when played with other cards. In particular, my favorite deck for Strangers has always been a Feln deck that plays Midnight Gale and Feln Stranger, as well as Champion of Cunning. Turning a Champion of Cunning or a Midnight Gale into a Feln Stranger could be a very good deal for you, so that might be something worth considering. Beyond that, I don't know that the card is particularly strong. It's just that like there is probably something that it does belong in that's going to be outrageous when it happens. So I'm intrigued. I don't know where this card fits yet. To be determined on this one. Horus Travers. Okay, Horus Travers is real interesting. Summon, gain an influence of your choice. A 1/1 for 1. This card is kind of a Seek power on a body, and that's actually pretty okay. So basically what you want to do is you want to use this in a deck that cares about aggro in 3 colors, which there are quite a few decks that care about aggro in 3 colors, and they really haven't been built out very much because they didn't have this kind of tool. Horus Travers allows you to gain influence into a lot of different types of decks. He's not just a Stranger card. Like, I think that if you have some way to do, say, rally tokens in 3 colors, which is something that I do a lot, or if you want to do like Felnscar aggro with like the Haunting Scream setup, like there are a lot of ways that Horus Travers can just make sure that you have the right influence to get a particular job done, and that is pretty meaningful. So a little while ago, somebody was asking me about using this with Power Stone, and I wanted to contrast the three of them, or contrast the three cards that I sort of consider to be like sort of the different options when you are doing different types of ramp, and talk about like what types of different things you're doing. So like if you are playing Seek Power, you're making your deck more reliable because you are playing your third power more often, and you're also getting influence of your choice more often, which is really, really good because it gets you into mid-range and into tempo. That's the kind of thing that you just want to do. If you're playing something like Power Stone, you're getting your third power more often and you're getting into your high drops more often, but you aren't getting into extra influence, so you just get the advantages of ramp, which are very good if you're trying to play into mid-range stuff. With Horus Travers, you gain influence more often, but you don't get power more often, which means that you most benefit when you're playing a lot of 2-drops and 1-drops in many different colors. That doesn't just include strangers, but it does mean that if you're playing like something that does a lot of Grenadin or a lot of like really interesting hybrid color cards, Horus Travers fits that mold pretty well. I think this card is actually very strong, and he interests me even more than Triumphant Stranger. There's a little bit where like when you win the final 2 cards in the deck, Triumphant Stranger will appear, and then Horus Travers is the next card, the final card, and I think that's actually like kind of appropriate because he's actually important. He does fulfill a lot of interesting roles. He opens up decks that we have never explored before, and for that reason I think Horus Travers is a very strong card and potentially one of the real reasons to pick up this expansion. So yeah, that's my thought on Horus Travers. So that's it for the spoiler breakdown. To the YouTube folks, thank you so much for watching. To the Twitch folks, we're going to get back into games. But what a good set. What a fun set.